So from a half kneeling position, oftentimes when you say take a passive hip flexor stretch, people will bend a bit more into the front leg to move the pelvis forward, and they might end up looking like this or even further down if they have a lot of flexibility. But you can see here too, yes, I'm feeling a stretch here on the front of the hip. I've also gone into a lot of spine extension. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just what often happens when you just kind of passively let the hips or the pelvis fall forward and towards the floor. So let's come back out of this stretch, bring the rear hip over the rear knee. We're going to keep the leg in this fixed position and move the pelvis relative to that leg. So let's come into anterior pelvic tilt. You're going to lift your tailbone up. There'll be some extension through the low back. And then posterior pelvic tilt. Squeeze that glute, tuck your butt under. And again, anterior pelvic tilt. And posterior pelvic tilt, scoop under, squeeze your glute. And one more time, anterior pelvic tilt and posterior pelvic tilt. Now we're going to remain in posterior pelvic tilt, so keep this glute engaged. We're going to shift the hips forward a bit, not as far as we did into our stretch position earlier, but just a little bit. So fight like crazy to keep posterior pelvic tilt. Come forward just a little bit. That's going to deepen hip extension. Probably feel more stretch here on the front of the hip. Keep your butt engaged, keep posterior pelvic tilt, and just shift back. Let's do that a few times. So a little bit of kind of leaning forward, bending through the front knee, and pushing back. Keep posterior pelvic tilt. This might be referred to more as dynamic stretching. Just oscillating back and forth, deeper into a hip flexor stretch, or deeper into hip extension each time we go forward. Okay, and come back to that back hip over the back knee. Now in this position, we're not going to move. I just want you to work on trying to engage different sides of the hip. So start squeezing your glute on the back leg and imagine that you could stretch that leg back behind you. Nothing is going to move, but trying to get that action of trying to pull the leg back behind you. Okay, and then release that. Imagine trying to drag your left knee or your back knee towards your front foot. So now you should get more front of hip stuff working. And switch again, squeeze this glute, try to pull the leg back behind you without actually moving. Have a little poke, see if your glute's working. Back of hip stuff, and then try to drag the back knee forward. You're going to get more front of hip stuff engaging. Okay, then we're going to combine those isometrics of squeezing stuff on the back of the hip, squeezing stuff on the front of the hip with our dynamic stretching, with the movement back and forth, and that's going to be our kinetic stretching. So at the top here, squeeze that glute like crazy. Try to pull the leg back behind you. Keep trying to pull as you slowly control the hips moving forward. So it's the pulling of the rear leg back that's helping to move the hips forward. At your end range stretch position, try to drag the back knee forward. Use front of hip stuff to push you back out. And again, squeeze glute. So use the tissue on the back of the hip to extend that hip. Pull, pull, pull through the back leg. And then drag the back knee towards the front foot. That's going to trigger you to push back out. And again, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Slowly make your way into hip extension. Keep engaging here on that glute and drag the back knee forward to come back up. So instead of the front leg driving the movement, most of the motion is ideally being driven by the back hip. Let's get one more. Squeeze that back glute. Pull that leg back behind you. Keep squeezing, pulling back as you move the hips forward. And then drag the back knee towards the front foot. Get hip flexor stuff to push you back out. So that makes up our kinetic stretching.